That's one of the things I'm going to ask my good friend and a great professional, Ben Swann, who is the founder of Truth in Media and Sovereign Media. Ben, welcome back. Been too long since we worked together. I said earlier, you were one of the very few, and maybe the only, for a time, journalist, broadcaster, who was warning us about all of this. Tell us how that felt and what's changed. How come everybody now knows that what you were saying a decade ago was correct?
Yep. Yeah, George, it's great to be on with you. I guess it's as simple as this. You know, as we said, well, the sign says it right there behind me on this side. Epstein is Pizzagate, right? Pizzagate is bigger than just Jeffrey Epstein, though. And so for a decade, as you mentioned, a decade ago, I was the first guy to come out. What do they say? The first bird out of the bush is the one to get shot. That's literally what happened to me. The first one to stand up and say this online conspiracy theory, first of all, the media is lying about it. They're lying to you about where it comes from. They're lying to you about the specifics around it. And all I did was just take a look at it and say, this is what the theory says, and here's where it comes from. It comes from emails that include a lot of code language, John Podesta's emails, that involve a lot of code language that is used by pedophiles, right? That's really all the story was. We pointed to the facts surrounding what was known as Pizzagate at the time. And for that, obviously, there was a very heavy price to pay professionally. So I paid it. So what? Doesn't matter. I'm grateful for everything that's happened since then, and certainly grateful to have been able to stand up at a moment when a lot of other people could not or would not stand up. A decade later, though, what do we find? We find that in the Epstein emails, he's using a lot of the same language and talking the very same way. And here's what I find so fascinating about this, George, is that in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, if you go back and you look at the Podesta emails and the specific emails referring to pizza and hot dogs and cheese pizza, the terminology that was used, which, by the way, was really first alerted to by self-proclaimed pedophiles on 4chan and 8chan. They were the ones who said, hey, does anybody else notice that's language we use? They were the ones who actually alerted to it. And I'm not saying John Podesta is a pedophile, right? I'm not making that claim. All I'm saying is that the claim was he's using an awful lot of code words, or a lot of words that are also used as code words by pedophiles. Now, here's what's interesting. When you read through these Epstein files, 911 times we see the terms for pizza and grape soda come up 911 times in these files. And all of those files, by the way, those emails are from the same time period, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. Why is that significant? Because I believe now that the reason we don't see those emails after 2016 and after 2017 was because of a thing called Pizzagate. Because of the fact that people like me and others stood up and said, by the way, this is the language that's being used. All of a sudden, that language went away. It doesn't mean they stopped doing what they were doing, but the language changed. And so it's very interesting to me as a journalist, as an investigator, to look at and see that Epstein was using a lot of the same language in these emails at the same time period as the emails that sparked Pizzagate in the first place.
It is one long and dismal chain of events. Without doubt, that's now established. But how central was Epstein to this whole affair? Was he, as Megyn Kelly very unwisely said, interested in the quote-unquote barely legal, or was he actually involved in the trafficking and raping of children? And were the people who were involved in the earlier Pizzagate revelations also involved? Were they present in the circle of Jeffrey Epstein?
So a couple of questions there let me try to answer them in this order. So first of all, we don't know, right? So the most important and most honest answer is we don't know. What we do know is that there are layers to this. So here's how I would best describe it, George. At the base level, everyone who's anyone over the last couple of decades seems to have known Jeffrey Epstein, right? Somehow, remarkably, Epstein seems to have connected himself to everyone, whether you're a musician, a model, an actor, a professional athlete, a politician, a money manager. He's connected to all these people, right? I guess that's the job of a CIA / Mossad asset, which is clearly what he was. It was to honeypot and to connect himself. He was connected to all these people. But does that mean everyone that Epstein was connected to is therefore a pedophile? Absolutely not. And so when you see these files, just because someone's name comes up in them does not mean that that person either was interested in underage girls or is a pedophile. Only an irresponsible person, I think, would believe that. That's the widest point of the circle. But then there's a circle within that circle of people that Epstein was apparently partying with, having fun with, taking to his island, taking to his New Mexico ranch. And that's a smaller group, but it's a group that is more involved maybe in the barely legal, because there are a lot of women who were trafficked and taken advantage of who were barely legal. But then there's another circle within that. And that's the circle that I'm concerned about all of it. Don't get me wrong. But the one that I'm most concerned with is that smallest circle where the evidence seems to point that there was an additional group of what you might call elites. I hate the term because it makes it sound like they are special people. They are not. They're depraved people. But these elite pedophiles, if you will, who are interested in the ritualistic and systematic abuse and even in some cases torture of young children and the sexual abuse of young children. There is a small group that seems to be within that group. And the Epstein files so far seem to bear out that Epstein was not interested in only, as you just pointed out, the barely legal. Not true. That was part of it. But there seems to be a lot of evidence mounting from these files that he was very interested in very young children as well. What's frustrating about this whole situation is that when you mass dump so much information, so many emails, so much communication, and you wrap so many people's names into it, what does that then begin to look like? Well, it looks like either everyone's guilty or everyone's name in there, so really no one's guilty. That's what it starts to feel like. But we could do a very easy exercise, in my opinion, to resolve some of this. There's an email that's been making the rounds today where someone writes to Epstein in 2014, and they mention how they say, your littlest girl was a little naughty last night, right? Had a great time last night. That's the context of the email. It's 2014. Here's the problem. The name is redacted. The only piece of information on this email that is redacted is the name of the sender. Now, George, why is that name redacted? Because I understand the idea of saying we've got to redact some names, and there are some people who, just because they're in these files doesn't mean there's anything sexual about these emails. But this one clearly is an email that references a sexual act. It clearly seems to represent the idea that it's a child when it says the littlest girl. So who are they talking about, and who sent this email? And in my opinion, there is a small circle within all these files that are the people who are involved in it is a satanic, in my opinion, a satanic group of people who seem to take pleasure in the ritualistic abuse of children. Who are those people? And that, I think there's a very simple exercise to find them. Anyone who's using code language, let's see the names. Or law enforcement should be seeing those names. Anyone who's referencing children, let's see those names. Law enforcement should see those names. And that's where we should really begin. Not with 3 million documents and saying everyone's equally guilty, but with focusing on the ones that seem to be pointing toward actual crimes against children.
But law enforcement is seeking to suppress all of this, has sought to suppress all of this. Kash Patel almost certainly perjured himself in front of the American Congress when he said there's no evidence that Epstein was trafficking to anyone. So Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison for no reason and is innocent. So law enforcement is entirely politicized in the United States. And Donald Trump is Kash Patel's boss. And Kash Patel is suppressing the proper investigation of these matters.
No, he absolutely is. How Kash Patel and Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, do not resign tomorrow, I have no idea how you can save face at this point. Because remember, just a few weeks ago, what were we hearing? We were hearing that there were no Epstein files at all, that there was no client list, that Epstein most certainly killed himself. He was not murdered. Dan Bongino, who no longer is even with the FBI, maybe had the shortest tenured career in the FBI in history, and now is back on his podcast, is out there saying, I was out there, man, fighting the good fight. You guys were doing nothing. You weren't fighting the good fight, Dan. Dan Bongino was laying cover for pedophiles. Dan Bongino was refusing to acknowledge the fact that there was millions, not just a couple, millions of documents that point toward Epstein's connections and his clients. And the fact that Kash Patel and Pam Bondi have gone around telling everyone there's nothing to see here. How can you possibly have any confidence in them and their leadership as the top law enforcement agents in the country? The only reason they'll be allowed to keep their jobs is because President Trump says, let's stop talking about Epstein. I don't think the public should go away from it. I think that we should be calling daily for the removal of Kash Patel as the head of the FBI and the removal of Pam Bondi as the Attorney General. Give me Matt Gaetz. Give me somebody else. Anybody else, but not these two, because they have discredited themselves to an unbelievable extent.
No, well, it's definitely not going away as an issue in Britain, and I'd be surprised if it does in the United States either. But it's funny that Epstein seems to have been so close to Woody Allen, because Woody Allen made many great films, and one of his underrated and great films was a film called Zelig, which was an imaginary figure who appeared in every great historical event. He somehow inserted himself into every picture. That's what Epstein was doing. This is not a guy, I'd never heard of him until the scandal began, 5, 6, 7 years ago, began to know about him, mainly through people like yourself. But this guy has been for decades, or was, if he's now deceased, for decades, right at the heart of global politics, Western politics. Putin wasn't hanging out with him. Xi Jinping wasn't hanging out with him, but everybody who was anybody in the Western political media class was connected to Jeffrey Epstein. It's obvious, isn't it, that he was an agent of American intelligence, Israeli intelligence, if there's any difference between these two things. But now in Britain, at least, they're trying to Russiagate the matter. They're trying to say it was all Putin that done it. How absurd is that?
Yeah, it's. I told someone the other day, I said, I've heard almost every scenario about Epstein that there is, right? Every claim about him that there is, because I have been covering him actually since 2013. So in that case, it's been long time, 12, 13 years that I've been covering Epstein, long before most people even knew who he was, to your point. And I will say that in all those years, I have never heard the claim before that Epstein was tied to the Kremlin or was tied to Putin. In fact, what the files bear out is that Epstein was not tied to Putin, but he was very closely tied to Zelensky. He was very closely tied to the upheaval in 2014 in Ukraine, that he sought to connect himself to Ukraine to take advantage of the situation there. And again, from these files, it seems to appear that he's connected to Zelensky in the attempt to traffic children out of Ukraine during the course of this war, and saw this as an opportunity. So what's interesting about this is what we see happening, again, as you said in the UK, is this attempt to say, well, it's all Vladimir Putin. See, Epstein's bad, therefore he must be tied to Russia. When in fact, he was not tied to Russia. He was a CIA asset, no question about that. And he was a Mossad asset. There's no question about that. Just as his girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, there in the UK, well known as a Mossad asset, who then commits suicide by jumping off of his yacht and drowning for no apparent reason. And within a very short time after that happens, some substitute teacher that no one's ever heard of by the name of Jeffrey Epstein becomes friends with Ghislaine Maxwell. And then suddenly he's a billionaire financier, right? The money came from somewhere. And it didn't come from Putin, and it didn't come from the Kremlin. To your point also, the fact is that about Jeffrey Epstein that is incredibly impressive is that on top of, and I don't mean that in a facetious way, it really is impressive. to think that this man, on top of being a prolific sex offender, maybe one of the most prolific sex offenders in human history, he is also so busy working deals with every powerful person in the Western world. Again, it's not just politicians, and it's not just those who are in finance or in technology, but every major athlete and model and actor he seems to have a connection to. This guy worked 80 hours a week, 100 hours a week, it seems like, in order to honey trap as many people as possible. So if he is a Mossad agent, which again, I think all the evidence points to that, and working with the CIA, and I think all the evidence points to that, the fact is he was very effective at what he was trying to do.
Without a doubt. I mean, no James Bond character could possibly match the achievements of Jeffrey Epstein, the most prolific sex offender in human history, almost certainly, although Genghis Khan might have done more, I don't know, too long ago. But he was also, without a doubt, the most successful agent in human history because,
yes,
well, frankly, he has compromised thousands of the most powerful, influential people in the Western world. Where does this all end, Ben? Is it going to bring down? It's going to bring down Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer might be out of 10 Downing Street tomorrow. Speculation is mounting here. Is it going to do for the Trump administration also?
It's a tough question, and I really don't know the answer to it. I certainly hope there is a reckoning associated with this, but I'm not convinced that there will be. In fact, I think it's very possible that we won't necessarily see that. And instead, what we will see is a lot of confusion surrounding these files, distraction, an attempt to move on to other stories. Some big event will take place that all of a sudden grabs up the attention because Americans, we're not very good at holding our attention on one thing. And so moving on from Epstein could happen, I think, much quicker than it should. What I hope will happen is that the public won't let this go, and that we'll continue to push and press, and that some of these powerful people who are associated, especially with the most heinous crimes that seem to be found in these files, will be brought to justice. I'm not convinced that will happen, but I do believe that if that doesn't happen, kind of a secondary victory would be to see that by the public being awakened to this, it would shift and change the ability of those who would seek to harm and to violate the most defenseless in our societies. It would put them on notice, and it would cause a disruption in their networks. So at the very least, I would hope that is happening. I believe to some extent, and maybe I'm naive, that 10 years ago, the exposure that surrounded Pizzagate created a disturbance within that space. I'm hoping that 10 years later, what's happening with Epstein will create a new disturbance in that space. And ultimately, these things can be dismantled, but it may take a very long time for that to happen. And it may also take a continued awakening in the consciousness of people to recognize that this is happening so that we can then stand against it. At least today, George, at least today, there are more people today who acknowledge that, yes, this is happening than there were just 3 or 4 days ago. And that alone is a victory.
Amen. You mentioned some significant event, a black swan event, wag the dog, call it what you will. That may be imminent in the Persian Gulf right now. And if there is a U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran, it will be a major regional war. And that may very well be the black swan event and the economic collapse in Europe, at least, that will be concomitant with the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, the disruption to oil and gas flows, and so on. Maybe they're going to wag the dog so violently that war, big war, is the only way they can make us look over there. What do you think?
I think that's very possible. I mean, typically, that is the kind of event that it requires, because it isn't just a 1 day or 2 day event, right? It drags on for weeks, months, or in some cases, years. And it's very easy to move the news cycle over something like war. And for Americans especially, we rarely pay a price for war. Our soldiers do, and our economy does, and our treasure is lost as a result of it. But in terms of the average person, doesn't necessarily feel the effects in the short term. And so it's easy to use war as a way of just creating distraction and obfuscation. And I think that very well may be the case. I certainly hope it is not. I hope that this administration continues to resist, because we've been hearing for days and weeks that it's imminent and it's going to happen, and yet it hasn't happened yet. So I'm hopeful that it won't happen. And I'm certainly hopeful it won't happen as a deliberate decision to create distraction and to cause people to move on from this story.
Lastly, Ben, I'm grateful for your time. I've been intimately involved with the Robert Maxwell story for many decades, actually 4 decades. I'll tell you about that next time we meet. But Ghislaine Maxwell is still, I was going to say rotting in jail, but she's been moved to a rather cushier, open type of prison. But what of her? She's a potential bomb, isn't she? Is her security safe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I would have thought actually that Ghislaine Maxwell, I'm surprised she's even still alive now, because she does know so much. I think the reason she is because there is now a certain level of confidence within those circles, those highest circles associated with Epstein, that there's not going to be a push to get information out of her. I think when Epstein was arrested, and I know there's a whole poll going on your site right now about whether he's still alive or whether he was murdered, and last we saw it was tied. Listen, the jury's out on that. Is he still alive someplace? I think there's a lot of evidence that indicates he could be, and that was not his body. There's also a lot of evidence that he was murdered in prison. The one thing there's not evidence for is the idea that he committed suicide. That's the one thing that I think most sensible people can agree, other than Dan Bongino and Kash Patel, can agree did not happen. But I think the reason that Epstein was either removed and moved on or was murdered, one of those two scenarios, is because there was an unsure belief about how the administration would treat him, whether or not he would ultimately be forced to testify, and what he would say. I think now there is a pretty strong confidence that nobody's going to make Ghislaine Maxwell talk. Nobody's going to cut her a deal. Nobody's interested in getting information out of her. As you said, she's been moved to cushier grounds. There's no reason to offer and to continue to build suspense around this story. In fact, keeping Ghislaine Maxwell alive goes along with the same narrative, which is that there really isn't much to the story and it's time to move on. Killing her only heightens the attention on the story.